to come out and to help me to support stopping and ending suicide. There is an event that takes place throughout the country on different dates that the National Suicide Prevention Organization holds throughout the country on different dates. But the date that is posted closest to us is quickly approaching, and the date is October 2nd. So for those who listen to the show, and maybe even for those who go on my Facebook page so they can argue about topics, I've been sharing the link to donate. Don't think that you have to make these big contributions, because you don't. Every dollar adds up, and every dollar counts. And this is actually the way that they fund crisis hotlines. A lot of people, I had one person say to me, well, shouldn't the state pay for that? Probably so. The state should pay for it, but they don't. There's a certain amount of funding that every nonprofit will get, right? But that doesn't take care of all the expenses that come along with having a 24-hour crisis line. And you'd be surprised how many people actually call the suicide prevention lines. And then comes referrals, and it's just all kind of resources for people who struggle with suicide, for people who have loved ones who have committed suicide and they struggle with the grief and bereavement process. Behind that, some maybe even guilt.
Right.
You know, so there's a lot that this organization does, and this is actually something that's very, very, very important to me as a mental health provider, as a parent, as a family member, and as a community member. We need to show people who struggle with suicidal ideations that they do have support. So I'm just asking people to go to the link that I've provided and donate. And if you are free to come out on October 2nd to Lehigh Valley Parkway at 12 o'clock, the walk starts. You could come and walk with Romanet.
Okay. And for those that don't have your Facebook link, is there a website they can go to?
They can go to FS, let me give it to you exactly so I don't misquote anything. You know, after you get to a certain age, you'll misquote in a minute, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, and I don't want to do that. So let me just pull it up. So we can, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, the walk that we are attending is the Out of the Darkness Greater Lehigh Valley Walk.
Okay.
So the website again is the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. You could just Google it and it'll take you straight to the website.
Okay, and let's hope that people listening will come out and will support, because this is a very important endeavor. So today, you and I have been talking, and I think this is pretty important to talk about the President Biden, more specifically, his student debt forgiveness program, and how that ties into the state of Black America. So just for informational purposes, you know, you and I did our research, and, you know, right now, student debt, the amount of debt that people have acquired over the years is nearly $2 trillion. I mean, that is the budget. I mean, for several nations, that would be their budget. And probably for years, $2 trillion. And that is just what students across this nation are being asked to pay back, which is astronomical. And why is it that our government is not prioritizing education? Why isn't education free in this country? So growing up in New York, you and I both grew up, you know, in the city. So I went and I looked at statistics from CUNY, from the City University of New York. And what I found out is that up until 1976, the cost to attend a city university was zero. If you were staying at it, I think it was the state as well, but if you stayed on campus, there was a cost for room and board, but the actual cost of tuition was $0. So if it worked then, why can't it work now? if the government was funding these programs up until 1976, why couldn't they have extended the programs? And I suspect that the banking industry, looking at the amount of students wanting to get an education, saw the opportunity for a windfall. Because now you have a loan that you cannot discharge. Even if you file for bankruptcy, you cannot get rid of student debt, student debt. That stays with you throughout your life. So you have to pay it back. So for the banking industry, of course, they're going to, look at that and say, well, there's a great potential there for profit. And they have profited to the tune of nearly $2 trillion. And, on average, the average student, and I just looked this up the other day, borrows about nearly $30,000. So about 92% of all student debt are federal loans, right? So you got to figure, on average, everybody, on average, $28,000, $30,000 of debt. Now, I don't know if that includes all 4 years, if they're talking yearly, right? I would tend to think it's probably yearly. They're borrowing $30,000 yearly to pay for their education. So you take a student that's 18, 19, 20 years old, entering their first year of college, and then pursuing a bachelor's degree. They leave college over $100,000 in debt. That's before they ever bought their first car, rented their first apartment. All of these things have to be factored in. So when you graduate from college, they're saying that your rent should only be a third of your income. So that means if you're going to leave college, be able to pay your student loans, have a roof over your head and eat, and maybe transportation and work, you probably have to have a 6-figure salary. How many companies are doing that with people just graduating college?
Not a lot of companies are doing that. But the scariest part of this whole thing, to me, is how the student loan debt really gives us a marker for the unequal and relative disadvantages in this country for Black people. These same statistics that you looked at in those numbers say that on average, Black Americans owe $25,000 more in student loan debt, and they come out after the end of 4 years and having paid for a couple of years, they at minimum owe $52,000 for student loans. And here's the worst part: they're not being paid what white America is being paid. So they're going into the workforce, and their white counterparts are making more money, but we owe more money in student loans. And I say we because I went to school and got a master's degree. At 54, I'll be 55. I still owe student loans, right? I owe loans for my kids. I owe loans.
Right.
Listen, I owe them blood. Right? So, and the argument that they have is that, but college graduates earn more money, right? But we as always, there's this unequal distribution because the people who are borrowing the most money, I read an article, and it said the people borrowing the most money are the students who have the primary earner in the home is unemployed. So the parents, when they come in from homes that maybe they're already living in poverty, they have to borrow the most money. They're maxing out loans, right? Because they need to pay for these schools. These schools are $55,000 and $56,000 and $60,000 a year. So they're maxing out loans, and then it's set up. The IRS has it set up where it's like this invisible tax break that rich people get when they are putting away money into these college funds. They get like a 25, but it's generational because the student, right? They get to put the money away. So listen to the racket. The parent gets to put the money away in these tax-free savings accounts. that are for school.
Mhm.
And then the student who had no out of pocket because the parent already put this money away gets a tax break of $2,500 every year on his taxes for money that he didn't even pay.
Right.
But yet the African American, the brown and black, we won't just say African American minorities in this country,
Mhm.
who have to borrow the most money, that $2,500 tax break that they get, that doesn't cover the interest that they're paying on the loans, because the loans are more.
Mhm.
So it's a racket.
Yeah, and I said at the outset how it ties into the state of Black America. I went and I looked it up. A lot of these large institutions, many of them Ivy League, they got their endowment money from off the backs of Black people, from slavery.
Mhm.
And it's pretty well documented. I pulled up an article where they were talking about Yale University and how Yale is named after Elihu Yale, who worked for the Dutch West Indies Company, which means he was involved in the slave trade.
Mhm.
And Ivy League school after Ivy League school came out with reports, and they talked about their involvement in the slave trade and how a lot of their money came from either indirectly from the slave trade or directly from the slave trade. I mean, I just read something where it says at one school, and I believe it was Brown University, they said there was many. Oh, I'm sorry, it's it says I think it's Dartmouth. I'm sorry, it's Dartmouth. There were arguably as many enslaved Black people at Dartmouth as there were college students.
Mm.
So the slaves were there maintaining the grounds of the campus, making beds, cooking, all of these things to support the student body. But now, here you have these prestigious universities, some of them costing into the $70,000-$80,000 per year for undergraduate studies. You made your money off the backs of Black people.
Mhm.
And then you charge these astronomical tuition rates to attend the school that their ancestors built.
Mhm.
It's insane. And when you talk about the student loan forgiveness program that the Biden administration put out, they're talking forgiving between I think $10,000 and $20,000. That's a drop in the bucket when the country as a whole has nearly $2 trillion in debt. So if you take the average student, African American student, who has, upwards of $100,000 in debt, is this $10,000 or $20,000 per year, or is it just
No.
one time?
No. It's one time, and we have to really think about this and who even this is designed to help.
Mhm.
It eradicates the loans for white people. I'm
Right.
sorry to say it, but
Right.
the average amount of student debt that white Americans come out of school with is like $28,000 a year, right?
Mhm.
Versus 50,000 and 55,000 for people of color.
Nearly double.
So, right. So if think about what takes place. If they say we're going to do debt forgiveness for $10,000 or $20,000, that takes care of their entire debt.
Mhm.
But it only takes care of a fraction
Mhm.
of what our students have.
Mhm.
So once again, it's an unequal distribution.
Mhm.
Because what we need to do is say we're going to take care and wipe out a percentage of the debt, which would then seem more equal across the board. If you said we're gonna wipe out 25% of the debt, my 25% would be greater than my white counterpart's 25%. That might be a little more fair.
Mhm.
But this thing with an actual dollar amount is not going to work. And then they're doing this income-based repayment, which is another. It's just real such nonsense.
Mhm.
It's a scam. It's a scam by the government to keep us in a position where we're again behind the eight ball.
Right. We've known for years that there is a educational divide, and it was planned, and the government assisted in this division. And for us, Black and brown people and the poor in this country. There was the digital divide, but we didn't have access to computers and other teaching aids that our Caucasian counterparts had. But for us as Black and brown people in this country, so-called minorities, how should we respond to this governmental program, which is basically a promise that Biden gave to get the Black vote, the Black and brown vote?
Mhm.
But is $10,000 or $20,000 adequate? When you talk about, when you look at it in a broader context where 400 years of slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, and even now in the 21st century, we still see incidents like George Floyd dying on, national television
On the street.
and broadcast around the world. Excuse me. We had a young man that was shot 60 times just recently in Ohio. Young Black man, unarmed, of course. We have Breonna Taylor. A year after her death, they're finally beginning to prosecute these officers who were involved.
Mhm.
Not necessarily for killing her, but the fact that they covered up.
Mhm.
They filed false documents to get a search warrant, and then they basically covered up their actions. So, is $10,000 and $20,000 adequate for our vote, for our labor, for the suffering of our ancestors, and what we're enduring to this very day? Is that enough?
Absolutely not.
So I think that for people, Black and brown people, and poor people in general, we need to question our government. We need to ask them the hard questions because, I just saw the other day they were doing an interview with President Zelensky of Ukraine. And it was David Muir interviewing him, and he said that I think an additional $13 billion in aid is on the way to Ukraine.
Mm.
I don't know exactly how much we've given them since the outset of this war, but just a small percentage of that would have eliminated most of the student debt in this country,
Mhm.
or put a dent in it, an appreciable dent. But we keep finding ways to raise money for war, but for education, for healthcare, for social programs, for aid for poor or dependent women. We can't find a dime for that, but we can always find the money to kill people. And I think that we in this country need to wake up, and we need to make demands on our government, not go asking them for anything. We need to make demands because Dr. King said in 1963, America wrote a check that came back insufficient funds.
Mhm.
And here we are,
Mhm.
50 plus years later, and it's still insufficient funds. So we have to start demanding, particularly those like ourselves whose ancestors built these colleges,
Mhm.
built these universities, and now our children are denied access to them. This is something that it's disgraceful.
Mhm.
And you talked about the Queen dying the other day, and how I believe it was Sonny Hostin made a statement in regard to the crown jewels. Well, let's be realistic. These, like so many other things, were stolen out of Africa, the resources and the people.
Mhm.
And now there's no shame involved in it.
Mhm.
They want Sonny Hostin, I guess, to feel bad for her statement, but it was factual.
Yes, it was.
And what's going on in this country is factual.
Mhm.
All of these Ivy League universities have put out reports detailing their involvement in the slave trade. So how in the hell are you charging us for what our ancestors put in place?
Mhm.
It's something that we need to talk about. And, I think for those of you that are just drowning in student debt, give us a call. The number here is 888-304-4401. Again, 888-304-4401. Let your voice be heard, because the only time the government really wants to hear from you is on election day. They don't want to listen to you when you're suffering. They don't want to listen to you when you're trying to decide to put gas in the car or food on the table. And from that perspective, I can almost understand why people would support someone like Donald Trump.
Mm.
I mean,
Mm.
well, it's because Donald Trump talked about putting Americans first. Prioritizing the needs of Americans as opposed to foreign investment and spending money abroad. So from that perspective, I can see why people would support someone like Donald Trump. Because for our current president, Biden, when he talks, most of what he is saying is in some way related to this war in Ukraine. He's not talking about the history of the Ivy League and how they got there and down. He's not talking about the American economy and how the American economy is built on the backs of Black people. So these are issues that we need to raise, and we need to demand that we be heard, because everybody has a right to be heard, that we be heard. And just like in Europe, they're giving back some of the antiquities, give us back some of what you owe us from 400 years.
I agree.
Yeah. It's really time that, we stop going to them, begging and pleading.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying we should go and storm the U.S. Capitol, right? Because we'll never get past, the first line of defense. They'll just start shooting, right? Oh, absolutely. They're just gonna start shooting.
Mm-hmm.
But I am saying that in terms of storming them with emails, with letters, with phone calls, making demands, because every year, for Black folks, every year, our state of the union is in decline. And I understand that this country is in recession, probably on the edge of a depression. But for us, we have been the faithful servant for 400 years. And, it's a controversial subject to bring up, but I'm going to be controversial. What happened in Nazi Germany happened over a period of about 12 years. And after that time, the governments, the former colonial powers got together and they compensated the victims and the survivors of the Holocaust. With that money, they were able to establish the nation of Israel, a nation that is thriving to this day. After 12 years, and all of that was not, during all of that time, there was not the persecution of Jewish people. That didn't begin until about 1935, when they started with the Nuremberg laws. But prior to that, yes, there was anti-Semitism, but it was ramped up around 1935. Well, for Black people in this country, and brown as well, because when we talk about persecution, we have to include the Native Americans. But for what we endured, for what they endured, I guess the government and people in this country are under the delusion that some programs like welfare is adequate repayment. Programs like affirmative action will make up for black men and women hanging from trees. That the fact that we're told now this is a post-racial America because we had Barack Obama. We need to wake up and realize that for every year post the end of the civil rights struggle, we have been in a state of decline. I heard someone say that one of the worst things that happened to Black America was the end of segregation. I thought that statement was crazy until I thought about it. And the reality is, prior to the end of segregation, We had to have our own hospitals, our own stores. Our communities were thriving. I mean, look what happened, and I'm wearing the shirt, Black Wall Street. These were Black people that went to a section of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and founded a little corner of Tulsa that would rival Wall Street in terms of the number of businesses they had, the number of educated people they had. This was a thriving community. And it was totally destroyed because Caucasians looked at it and were jealous and could not believe that their former slaves, the people that they would not grant access to go into their stores or their hospitals, had created a society that was much more advanced economically than theirs.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I don't think there's anything controversial about what you said. I think it's just factual. That's exactly what transpired. And to this date, to today, we have not been given any type of reparations. Welfare, I'm one of those people, some people get mad at me to say this, but I believe welfare is a setup, and I believe that it was put in place to keep us in a state of poverty.
Well, that's what it was. That's what it was designed to do.
And we have to, as a community, say, no, we're not going to do this anymore. Because prior to welfare, we had to figure it out.
Right. Absolutely.
But they handed out welfare, and then people they call us lazy, but they put us in a position to settle for just welfare because opportunity was scarce. And so what do people do when there is scarce opportunity and resources, right? And ways for you to go make a living, and they try to strip us of doing things independently of them. Then people are desperate, and so they take that handout, and then the handout turns into them calling us lazy. So at some point we got to wake up. We have to wake up. We have to do exactly what you said and demand that some of these issues, like student loan repayment, be revamped. This thing with this income-driven repayment is a fallacy. It's just a bunch of hogwash. It has actually created more defaulted loans than before. They implemented that program because I think it was like 2012, 2015. They implemented that income-based repayment. So what happens is that the payment is smaller because it's income-driven, and it's disposable income, right? So they look at what you have left after you total out all your expenses, and then it's a percentage of your disposable income. So the payment is smaller, right? But the term of the payment is longer. Right?
So if you die and get resurrected, you got to
still
paying your loans,
you're
right?
Still paying.
Right.
So and it has resulted in more defaulted loans because how long does somebody pay a student loan?
Right.
And even if you are making $100,000 a year, let me just say this: these income-based, these income-driven repayment programs. Let's say you make $100,000 a year, they're coming up with $700 and $800 payments. Don't tell me they're not, because I've experienced it.
Right.
So how do you, right, as a single woman, raising two sons, how can you afford, even with $100,000 a year income? Because $100,000 a year is not a lot of money in a one-parent household with two children, right? $100,000 a year. How do you afford to pay $700 or $800 a month back in student loan? And so then if they look at disposable income, then they lower the payment. But now I have a 35-year-old and a 31-year-old, and we still pay. So,
and you know something? As I recall, when Obama was president, he wrote in his book that right before he ran for president is when he paid off his made his final student loan payment. And that's after he got the proceeds from the book, right? But prior to that, here's a man that's been out of college for years that was actually a professor teaching constitutional law, still paying back student debt. But here's another thing that I find interesting. So for a young, gifted, person of color in this country that wants to go to college, Okay, if you don't qualify for, Pell and the other grants, and you have to go out and take loans, you're going to accumulate, six-figure debt. However, someone goes to prison and gets a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, and who's paying for that?
We are.
Right. So how is it that we can provide education for people who are incarcerated, who committed heinous crimes, but for people, young people,
Thriving students.
right, bright, intelligent young people that only want to escape their situation and surroundings, it's a fight for them to get into college and to be able to pay for it. Something is wrong, when we live in a society that prioritizes educating incarcerated people, but not people who are out here every day struggling to get an education.
Well, let's look at this, and this is factual. Let's just look at it momentarily. Why would we say that we will finance an education for someone who is incarcerated? People of color are the majority of people incarcerated. Right?
Absolutely.
And so why would the government have us finance educations for people who are incarcerated versus thriving, bright, intelligent students who are trying to, in fact, escape poverty, right? By going to school. Those people who come out of prison, they can't use those degrees. 9 times out of 10, they can't use those degrees.
Right.
Because the felony is on their record. So they don't pose a threat to the system. It still keeps us at bay, and the government can say, what are you talking about? We've provided education for people who are incarcerated, but it's an education that they'll never be able to use. If they go to school and attain a law degree, go to school in prison and attain a law degree, they can't sit for the bar.
No, they can't.
If they go to school and they get a nursing degree, they can't go and sit for the nursing licensure exam. They can't get a license. So you can't get any of these licenses with a felony. The last I heard, you can't even sell real estate with a felony. So it's all a fallacy.
Well, I think they know that there's a high rate of recidivism. They know that these guys are coming back to prison, to feed the system, because years ago, and I'm talking in the 20s and 30s, they would lend out inmates to do, say, road projects, digging ditches, building roads. So in that way, the cost to the construction company would be much lower. So they would just pay the warden, and warden would pocket the money and say, send about 20 guys. Well, nowadays, the same concept is at play in some of these, usually the privately owned prisons, where you have prison labor again. So some of these telemarketers that will call your house and, offer you to buy subscriptions, some of them are calling from prisons. Telemarketers and others are being utilized by prison labor. Labor costs are cheap. So, they know that these guys are coming back because once you've been in jail for 15, 20, 30 years, you're institutionalized. It's hard to reintegrate yourself back into society. And you come out and you're breathing free air for the first time in years and years. But so much has changed over the years that you feel totally out of place. And then you have a master's degree, 2 master's degrees.
And how about this? You come out, you have the master's degree or 2 master's degrees, you're institutionalized, and you have post-traumatic stress disorder. You have anxiety disorder. They're coming out with all kind of mental health problems, right? And they're coming out completely out of touch with society and culture. I've seen some people come out, they don't even know what to do with a cell phone. I can remember a family member that came out, and he didn't know it was a cell phone. When he went in, there were no cell phones, right? So they come out out of touch. They come out beaten and battered. And I say beaten and battered because you don't spend 13 or 14 years incarcerated and don't come out with post-traumatic stress disorder. It's impossible.
Right.
So, and on top of that, they can't get a job.
Right.
So it's all just a setup. It's a sad setup.
I remember I was probably in my late teens, early 20s. I was applying for a security job. And there was a guy there who was applying for the same position. And he was saying that he had 2 master's degrees and wanted to know if he could make a little bit more. The problem was he had been incarcerated.
Mm-hmm.
So here you come out, you have 2 master's degrees. I mean, you studied, you work hard, you earned 2 master's degrees. And you come out and you're applying for a security guard job. And I think at the time, it may have been somewhere in the neighborhood of $5 an hour. It didn't cost him anything to obtain those degrees because he was incarcerated. But just imagine a student, and you said Black people on average $52,000. When you come out of college and your first job, are you going to make enough money to provide for yourself and pay back these student loans?
No.
For the last maybe 10, 15 years, the trend is students graduate from college with a bachelor's degree or master's, and they come back home. In New York City right now, I saw an article maybe a month ago. The average apartment in New York City is $5,113 a month.
That's right.
And if your rent is supposed to be only a third of your income, that means you have to be making somewhere around in the neighborhood about $16,000 a month.
Mm-hmm.
Who can afford that?
Mm-hmm.
For people who live in New York, I don't know how they do it anymore. With rents that high, and we're not talking about just on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. We're talking all over the 5 boroughs. The rents have gone up dramatically.
It's $5,000 to live with Mickey.
Right. Exactly.
Mickey and Ben.
Right.
Live in the apartment.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
For $5,000.
Right. And of course, what happens is this might just be a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, but you have 5 or 6 people living there.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because you simply cannot afford it. And these are people who graduated college, who got the bachelor's, who have the master's, who may be working on their doctorate. But the reality is the economy is such that it's not creating those high-paying jobs. And the biggest problem, or one of the biggest problems for people in this country is the value of your dollar. It's worthless. Now, you and I are in the same age group. When we were kids, you could take $1, go to a store, buy soda, potato chips, candy, and still have money left over, still have change. I can remember when the train fare was 35 cents. With $10, you can go to a movie, hot dog, popcorn, soda, and still come home with $4 or $5 in your pocket. Nowadays, the same movie theater. Oh, and let me back up. In the early 70s, you got 3 movies and a cartoon. So you were in a movie for 8-9 hours, right? For $3.50 admission.
How about this one?
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in Harlem.
Right.
We went to the Apollo. My mom used to take us to the Apollo. To the Low East was right next door. You go to the Apollo. I can remember my mother taking us to the Apollo to see Claudine, right, for $3. And then Claudine went off. And the curtains went up, and it was a full show with Diana Ross and the Supremes.
Right.
This is a full show for $3.
Right.
I can remember going to Mr. Eddie's candy store and getting a pickle, a bag of potato chips, a soda, and some had change for now and laters or Jolly Ranchers to throw in the bag.
Right.
Too. You're not doing that now.
Not anymore. The same movie right now is $10 on average per person. And for popcorn, the big popcorn, I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood about maybe $10 or $15. So if you're a family of 4, you are easily spending $100 to go to one movie, just one. So what they do is when you walk in a movie theater, you're sitting there watching the previews for 40 minutes to fill the time. Then you watch one movie, then it's out the door. So the value of your dollar has decreased every year steadily till it's nearly worthless.
And the worst part of that is that children who are living in poverty, black and brown children specifically who are living in poverty, they don't get to experience any of that.
No, they don't. They don't.
There's no money for that.
Absolutely.
Who could afford to take 3 children if you already living in poverty?
Mm-hmm.
You can't go to the movies.
Nope, you cannot.
You can't go to the movies. You can't go. We took trips to Six Flags as kids, and as teenagers. When I was growing up in Harlem, they had whole bus rides
Mm-hmm.
where they take all the kids to. You can't do that. Who could do that now?
Well, you know something? During that time, I can remember programs called Model Cities. You remember that?
Mm-hmm.
So in the summertime, they would take students and they would expose them to colleges
Mm-hmm.
and they would job training and things of that nature. We don't do that anymore. There's no funding for it anymore. Again, we can always find the money to kill people, to, weapons of mass destruction. We can always find the funding for that. When you talk about saving lives, during the pandemic, and I'm talking during the height of the pandemic, when people were dying in record numbers, we didn't have adequate masks, we didn't have gloves, we didn't have surgical gowns. There were so many things we simply did not have. How is that possible? In a country that is the richest country on the planet and arguably the richest country ever. How?
Well,
and why?
I'm gonna say this. They're gonna get mad at me, Ron. But the same, we have that, and we live in a country like that because we live in a country where within our own communities, and I'm gonna say it, they could be mad. They will give 10%, live in poverty and give 10% of their income to a church that does nothing for their community, does nothing for the people who are in the church. But then programs like that program, right? And programs even like the suicide wall. It's like pulling teeth to get somebody to give $20 or $25 to support something that is needed. People who live in poverty, they're the biggest population who feel feelings of hopelessness and despair. They should know that because they're living in poverty, but they won't give to this. They won't get to that organization, but they'll run to give their money to a church that gives nothing back. And again, this is not to bash churches, but we have to come up as a people. We have to come up. We have to come up so that we can advocate for change with the government. We have to come up so that we can advocate within our own communities to say, like, wake up. When I think about advocating within our own communities, I think about Spike Lee's movie School Days, where at the end, he's screaming at the end, wake up. It's like we have to wake up.
And you raised an interesting point, because I have no problem donating to a church or religious organization that is doing something constructive within the community.
Right.
So when you talk about these Ivy League colleges, and of course, colleges and universities in general, a lot of them were established by religious orders. You take a college like Brigham Young, the Mormons, right? There are Catholic universities like Notre Dame. Now, yes, we have the HBCUs, but we don't support them.
No, we don't.
The primary funding for HBCUs comes from other people and corporations. We don't devote our money to HBCUs. Now, things have improved a little bit over the years. Now that somebody like Deion Sanders has taken over the head coaching responsibilities at Jackson State, not only has his notoriety helped in terms of donations, but student athletes who are some of the best in the country are going to Jackson State to learn under Deion Sanders. So there's been some improvement, but in our communities, in poor communities, we don't see where the churches are getting together to build things like clinics, schools. And I'm not even talking about a university. What about a daycare center? What about an elementary school, right? but we can take young children and give them a good foundation in K-12 education.
Mhm.
Because for a lot of our students, the problems that they develop is because they have a lack of a solid foundation.
Mhm.
So when they go to school, not having developed proper study techniques, they find themselves falling behind the other students. And after a while, they just leave.
Mhm.
So, that's something that, yeah, I would donate to a college, to a church or a church-based organization that is doing something in the community that is going to benefit our people.
Well, remember what we said on a previous show. We said that, the people in the church aren't even questioning what the church is doing with the
Mhm.
money, right?
Right.
So they're giving the money, they're not doing anything in the community, and we're not holding them accountable. So we don't hold the churches accountable, we don't hold the government accountable, we don't hold anybody accountable, we don't hold our own communities, our next door neighbors accountable. We're not holding anybody accountable. So what happens? We have no vision, right? And where there's no vision, people perish. Right?
Absolutely.
And that's the state of emergency that we're in right now. Student loans is just a touch
Mhm.
of the bigger and broader problem in our community. But this is an example of how, and that's what I want people to get from today. This is another example of how they keep us in a position where we are at a disadvantage. This is just another example. And this is another example of the unequal distribution of wealth and power in this country.
And they talk about stuff like equity, inclusion, and diversity.
For who?
Right. But where is it? Where's the equity
Yeah.
and where's the inclusion?
Yeah.
Right? Where's the inclusion? Because I don't want to say that Black men are not going to college, because they are,
Mhm.
but not in the same numbers as, say, Black women, right? Black men are falling through the cracks,
Mhm.
and there's no safety net, right? When you fall, there's no safety net to catch them, right? So they continue to fall. So we have these rising numbers of Black and brown prison inmates.
Mhm.
And, that's by design. So, I just think that we need to be more forceful with our government and start demanding. And then we have a great responsibility of our own to do for ourselves what we don't really have to rely on others. If we are the people that built the pyramids, then certainly we can build our own communities.
That's right.
Right? We don't need help in that. The knowledge is just in our DNA.
Mhm.
We just need to tap into it. And, this is just, like you said, a symptom of a much bigger problem. But I just think that in the case of education, education is so important. Proper education is so important. It is the pathway to freedom. Because even though we're not on the plantation, we still have the plantation mentality.
That's right.
So education is the pathway to freedom, to break that cycle of dependence and ignorance. And, we're being systematically closed out of access to higher education. So, in that respect, we need to do it for ourselves. And it's just really a shame that religious organizations cannot work together, And I was thinking about something the other day. There are, like I said, Catholic archdioceses that establish schools
Mhm.
and colleges and universities, part of the Roman Catholic Church, which is interesting because the Romans hated Christians. They killed them, right?
Mhm.
But then they come out and build, the biggest church on the planet, right? In terms of membership, is probably the Roman Catholic Church, a church that, they say killed Jesus, right? But now they have gone out and established the archdioceses around the world. And here we are in America arguing over, we probably need some new pews. You know what I mean? Really, because Sister So and So been on that pew so long that she bought the armrest, right? So that's what we look at things on such a small scale, right? That we don't imagine ourselves as having our own universities, funded by us, built by us. If you think about it, a Jehovah's Witness, they build their own temples.
I know.
The men and the women get together and build their temples with their own hands. We have black construction workers. We have brown construction workers. We have black architects and engineers. Why aren't we building schools?
Because we're building churches.
Yeah.
I mean, the people gonna be mad at me,
Right.
but this is what it is. This is what it is.
Well, look, you're right. Yeah, you're right. That we're really behind in so many areas. But this is a conversation that we need to continue. Because people need to be aware of the challenges they face and what challenges generations ahead, the coming generations, are going to face. But it was the time just goes by so quickly. When you're having an in-depth conversation. And again, this is something we need to continue. But, next week, we're going to talk about the Queen and the jewels that were stolen from Africa, the people and the resources. So you're going to be away on assignment, right?
Yes.
Okay. So we're going to hopefully have a guest that will join us, and maybe you can join us via video.
I will join you via video.
And folks, I hope you got something out of this, and you're drawing the same conclusions that we are. It's time now for us to rise up as a people and make demands. But it's been another great hour with you, and we hope to see you again next Saturday, same time, same place. So you enjoy this first Saturday of the fall.
Enjoy. And wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up.
It's time to get up.
And if you are awake, what the kids say, stay woke.
Stay woke.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, folks, for joining us.
All right.